All right, we're going to continue with the rest of our program. So come have a seat. There's still a lot of chairs at the front that are also free. Because now we're going to get a bit more into the workshop as well later on. So it's good to have a good view of the screen. So we're really happy to have with us today Michael Cruickshank, who's a freelance journalist and open source intelligence researcher. And we're very happy to also handle this topic of climate change and how it plays a role in political conflicts. Since we didn't handle the topic directly this year, but we had a conference in September which was dealing with open source intelligence and grassroots journalism, so we felt it was important to look at it in a bit broader angle, and the research of Michael really connects very well with that. Michael is originally from Australia and studied at the University of Queensland and also at the Fudan University in Shanghai, and now he is here based in Europe. And he's been investigating the nexus of security, technology, and the climate crisis, and is currently working on a new project called Anthropocene Intel, which attempts to model and predict the security crises that are caused by environmental political factors. So he will give first a talk. After that, we have a very short break, and then we will go into a workshop so we can actually learn a bit more about this topic ourselves as well. So thanks, Michael, for being with us today.
Thank you. Right, so I suppose if this was a TED talk, I'd open up by talking all about how, technology is making our lives better, everyone's lives are getting longer, all of the Millennium Development Goals are being met, and, everything's getting better. But that's not what I'm going to talk about tonight, because that's not the truth of the situation. The truth of the matter is that our world is getting more and more unstable, and the primary driver of this is climate change. Climate change is scientific fact. It's already here. In fact, global temperatures have risen more than 1 degree since pre-industrial times, and moreover, it is something that is continuing to get worse and will get worse at a faster rate into the future, even if the best case scenario occurs and nations around the world begin to take action. It's still going to get worse, and it will still cause increasing levels of instability. And this isn't just my opinion. This is the opinion of almost every military, intelligence, aid, and development organization around the world, who all believe that climate change will be a primary driver of instability into the future. And given this, having the right tools to analyze and predict this kind of instability will be vital to maintaining the cohesiveness and stability of our civilization into the medium and long-term future. One of the primary threats posed by climate change is, of course, an increase in conflict and war. Now, you wouldn't think this would be a particularly controversial position to take. However, I recently had a discussion, well, let's call it a discussion anyway, on the place where all great discussions happen, twitter.com, with somebody who was claiming that basically the idea of climate conflicts is more or less rubbish, and that it plays such a small role that it is simply non-existent. Interesting position to take, given that it flies in the face of, again, all these major organizations and governments, etc., but nonetheless. He did raise one important point, however, and that is that the role that climate plays in conflict is generally a secondary one, but also an amplifying one. So other factors aside from climate that obviously play a much larger role in conflict are things like the low socioeconomic development of a country and the low capabilities of the state. A third factor that I haven't mentioned here on the slides, but is also important, is whether these countries have a marginalized minority within them that is systematically discriminated by the state in question. For example, the Rohingya in Myanmar or the Kurds in Turkey. So if we are trying to look for climate conflicts, we want to look at the intersection of climate as well as these other factors that are also main primary drivers of conflict. Here we have a quote from Rosemary DiCarlo, the UN Political Affairs Chief, who notes that major armies and businesses have long recognized the need to prepare for climate-related risks, rightfully assessing climate change as a threat multiplier. So how can we analyze climate change as a conflict multiplier? One solution is open source intelligence, and this is going to be the topic of my presentation tonight. So what is open source intelligence? Well, for those who aren't familiar, Open source intelligence effectively is analysis, reporting, investigation based on publicly available information. And this publicly available information is regarded as open sources. What are open sources? Well, you have things like social media posts, open databases, satellite imagery, open sensor data, and position monitoring systems like GPS tracking and this kind of thing. The important thing to realize is that in the modern day, data is everywhere. Over the last 20 years, there's been a massive explosion in the amount of data that we are creating. However, this data is poorly understood and it is often poorly connected together. So within an open source intelligence investigation, what we are trying to do is to connect disparate pieces of data to create a narrative of what's going on and a better understanding of the situation. Some common strategies that are used to achieve this are things like geolocation, which is when you take an image or a video and try to work out exactly where it was taken within space. And this is an example you can see up on the screen here of a geolocation I did of a airstrike in Yemen that killed approximately 50 children. And here, this is just explaining how I used different elements within the image and then compared them to satellite images in order to work out exactly where the bomb landed. Another strategy is something called chronolocation, which is effectively doing the same thing as geolocation, except you're doing it in time rather than space. And this can be done using shadows within images, working out the position of the sun in the sky if you know what time of day it was, etc., to work out what time something was taken. And then finally, you have things like comparative monitoring, which is where you look at a very large object or space or even a region and compare it over a long period of time to notice changes and to see, what you can get out of that. Some common tools that open source intelligence uses for social media analytics, you've got things like TweetDeck. You can go deep into Facebook groups, although these days I think they're not quite so useful. You've got Telegram channels, location-based Snapchat searches, etc. Then for satellite imagery, you've got some of the larger providers like Google Earth, which despite being a relatively commonly used tool, is also quite useful because it has things like historic imagery that you can go back in time and see what something looked like several years ago, for instance. You've got platforms like Wikimapia, which are again a lot like Google Maps, except the difference is that people can annotate onto the map what is there. So it often includes vastly more information than you would normally find on something like Google Maps, Google Earth, etc. Then you've got some of the commercial providers like Planet and Digital Globe, who have higher resolution or more up-to-date images. Some of them, like Planet, for instance, takes pictures of everything every day. So if you need really up-to-date stuff, that's where you go. And then you have analytical tools like Earth Observation Browser, which I'm going to touch on later in this presentation on how it can be used in some of the applications there. For databases, you've got ACLED, which is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Database, which is something I'll also explain later on. You've got things like NSN Now, which is a database of US military serial numbers. You've got business registers, leaked ID databases, all these kind of things. And then finally, it's just some other tools that are very useful. You've got reverse image searching, which is probably something that a lot of people here are familiar with, but for open source intelligence, incredibly useful because it's really good for just verifying whether an image was taken at the time that it claims to be or whether it was an older image which is being misrepresented as something that it is not. And then finally, you have SunCalc, which is a tool that you can see up on this screen here, and it is a way of working out the position of the sun in the sky at a given time and using that for chronolocation. So why is open source intelligence something which is useful for monitoring and predicting or tracking or analyzing climate conflicts? Well, the important thing to realize is that the effects of climate change happen at a very large scale, at a regional or a country, continental or even global scale. So to monitor and have a better understanding of what's going on, we need to collect data from a very large geographic area, something that isn't really possible by doing a traditional on-the-ground journalistic investigation. Just say by talking to people, you won't get as big a picture as really looking at an entire region. And for this reason, having this kind of higher vantage point enables us to have a better understanding of what is going on. So this is why it's useful. Now let's look at some applications. I've got two case studies I'm going to present tonight on how open source intelligence can be used to look at the climate conflicts or climate crises, etc. The first is the Basra water crisis. Now, the story that was reported goes a bit like this. Between June and September last year, violent unrest in the south of Iraq, particularly in Basra, killed at least 15 people. Government buildings were torched, as well as the headquarters of pro-Iran Shia militia and the Iranian consulate in Basra. The alleged catalyst was poor sanitation due to clean water and government corruption and mismanagement. So if we want to have a look at what role perhaps climate played in this, we need to zoom out a bit and take a look at where Basra is geographically. The city sits at the confluence of Iraq's two major rivers, Tigris and the Euphrates. Just north of the city, they join to form a waterway known as the Shatt al-Arab, which then flows into the Persian Gulf. In the summer of 2018, however, the flow of these two rivers decreased substantially, and so much so that salt water from the Persian Gulf intruded up the Shatt al-Arab and turned the waterway saline, which meant that it was unable to be used by the water treatment plants, and then there was no water to drink and no water for industry to use. When this happened, the Iraqi government, for its part, blamed dams in both Iran and Turkey for causing the problem. They claimed that both countries were cutting off the water that was going into these rivers. The two dams in question were the Ilissu Dam on the left here, which is in Turkey. It's a very large dam that was recently completed. And then the other one is the Daryan Dam in Iran, which sits on the Sirwan River, which itself is a tributary of the Tigris River. So some key questions that we have here. Firstly, did Turkey and Iran really cut off water flowing to Iraq via the Tigris River? Can we establish a chain of events which led from climate change to the violent protests in Basra in 2018? And thirdly, did climate change play a role as a catalyst or more as a multiplier to the event? So to do this, let's look at some satellite imagery that you can take from Planet, which is, I mentioned earlier, is a provider of satellite images. These are all images of Ilissu Dam in Turkey. The north side of the dam is the upper side, so which is the part that is expected to fill with water when the dam is completely full. These images are taken in June, September, and December. If you look at both the June 30 and September 2 images, which were taken during the height of this crisis, you can see that the level of water in the high side of the dam does not increase. Indeed, there is nothing there, which indicates that the Turkish government has not, or the operators of the dam have not started filling this dam up. And then by December, however, the amount of water has increased, which suggests that at this point, the dam did start to fill up. And interestingly, this backs up the position that the Turkish government had, which was that they actually delayed the filling of this dam because of the low water levels in the river. But what of the dam in Iran? Here we have, again, this time 4 images, all of different times of the Daryan Dam. And just some things to understand about these images. It's kind of difficult to see, but there is a large spillway which comes down over the dam wall, which is the primary exit point for water. And then there's also a secondary lower outlet pipe at the bottom where water can also flow through. In the first image on April 12, you can see that water is flowing down the spillway as well as out of the lower outlet pipe. However, by June 13, water is no longer coming down the spillway, but there is still water coming out of the lower outlet pipe. Then by July 22, you can notice that the water level in the dam is substantially lower, and there is no water going over the spillway, and there is very little that's coming out at the bottom as well. And then finally, by September, the water level is even lower. There's still no water coming out of the spillway, and the riverbed down the bottom is all but dried up. So from this, we can see that at least at some point over this period, the Iranians did restrict water that was coming out of this dam. However, at the same time, the water level was decreasing. So the question is, was this a man-made crisis? Did Iran cut the water off, and then this caused the problems that were happening in Basra? Well, yes, this is a man-made crisis, but it's much bigger than these dams. Let's take a look at some contrary evidence. These are 3 photos, all sourced from social media, of different areas on the Tigris River, and they were taken in Mosul and Baghdad, and they all show incredibly low water levels. In fact, they were described as historically low water levels at the time. However, all of these images are taken upstream of the confluence of the Suwan and Tigris River. So this is all upstream of the water that would have hypothetically been coming from this dam in Iran. So something else was happening. And what was happening was the serious drought in the region. Here we've got a selection of quotes that are describing the connection between the impact of this drought and the connection between climate change and the drought. They talk about how in the 2017-18 season there was 1/3 less rainfall than average. The Iraqi Ministry of Water Resources described these effects as because of climatic conditions. We've got the Jerusalem Center of Public Affairs talking about the main factors which contributed to this humanitarian catastrophe with a 6-year-long ongoing drought characterized by erratic rainfall. And then you finally got a scientific source talking in the Journal of Earth Sciences talking about climate change and an ongoing drought that's lasted decades in the region, and this drought itself reached a crisis point in 2018. So taking all this into consideration, we can say a couple of things. Firstly, that based on the open source intelligence investigation that we did here, the effects of the drought in Iraq and the upstream countries played a significant role in the unrest in Basra, and the drought itself is linked to climate change. The blocking of flow from Daryan Dam in Iran likely exacerbated this and may have also been linked to the drought. As I mentioned earlier, you could see that the water level was decreasing, but no water was also coming out the bottom of the dam, which strongly suggests that inflows as well were very low, and likely due to the drought, because Iran was also at the same time being affected by the same drought. And then finally, it's important to understand that this event did not happen within a vacuum. And climate change simply acted as a multiplier for the existing political problems as well as the crumbling infrastructure due to years of civil war. And tragically, this has played out over the last few months as well. There's been very violent, much more violent than these protests, but in the very same areas, same political factors at play, but much less about the sanitation conditions in the water and much more about the Iranian influence within the country. So obviously, while climate change did play a role, there are also very large political factors driving this. And this is the case for almost all of any kind of conflict around the world is going to be a combination of any kind of climate conflict, is going to be a combination of political and environmental factors. Now for a second case study. This time we're going to look at the situation that's currently ongoing in Zimbabwe. Again, what's being reported is that Zimbabwe is in the midst of a very serious economic and political crisis that has worsened since the 2017 coup that brought down the former president, Robert Mugabe. The new president, and I apologize in advance for my pronunciation, Emmerson Mnangagwa, has presided over rising food shortages and serious hyperinflation within the country. And anger at the poor economic situation and the lack of affordable basic goods has led to frequent unrest, which itself has caused government crackdowns. So I was doing some research into the situation there, and I came across this picture on Twitter. And it's an image of the Victoria Falls, which is probably the most famous landmark in Zimbabwe. In fact, it sits on the border of Zimbabwe and Zambia. And in this photo, you can see that the falls aren't really there. There is very little water coming down, and the water level in the Zambezi River is so low that it's basically all dried up. However, a single photo is not always a great piece of evidence. It can be a misleading angle, perhaps. It could be taken, maybe it's like this every year during the dry season. I don't really know. So we need more data to verify that something weird is going on, or something anomalous. So I took a look at some data, which is from the Zambezi River Authority, which is available online publicly. And I apologize, the colors here are kind of making it hard to see, but effectively, I took two hydrographic station readings and compared them to previous years, including previous record years. And what you can see here is that the water levels in the Zambezi River are at near historic lows, particularly during the wet season. So obviously, so this kind of data is vastly more reliable than just a single image. But what we can see from this is that indeed something anomalous is going on. There is something serious which is causing the lack of water in the region. And what that is a huge drought that is currently affecting the majority of southern Africa. This is an image which I took from the Global Agricultural Drought Monitoring and Forecasting System, which is run by CISSS. And what it shows is that, the majority of the region is in extreme or exceptional drought, including Zimbabwe. Well, what impact is this actually happening on the ground? Well, one thing to consider is that maize harvests, which represent the area's staple crop and a large portion of people's nutrition, or at least caloric intake, are expected this year to be around 40% lower than they are on average. And the total domestic production is expected to satisfy less than 50% of the demand. And this has caused the price of food in the country to skyrocket. Maize has tripled in price over the last 6 months. This is something you can see in this graph here. It only goes through August this year, but other data sources put this rise in prices as continuing. The other thing to note here is that the problem is being compounded by simultaneous hyperinflation, the hyperinflation is being caused at least partially by the need to purchase essentials, including food from abroad, using foreign exchange, which is resulting in trade deficits and further fueling the hyperinflation. The role that these economic factors play in this is something which is certainly worthy of deeper investigation, but given I'm not an economist and this isn't a presentation about economics, I'm only going to touch on it today. Now here we have a quote from a member of Zimbabwe's Public Weather Service. He notes that some of the things that we are seeing now, such as prolonged droughts and dry spells, are a result of climate change. This is an interesting statement, but again, it's just one person's opinion, no matter how qualified they are. Can we look at some data to back up what they're saying? Is what's going on here really anomalous? One way we can do this is using remote sensing and something called Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. And what this is a measurement of the relative levels of certain wavelengths of light that correspond to different kinds of vegetation. And this can be monitored using satellite platforms and remote sensing. The important thing to remember here is that a higher NVDI reading represents healthy vegetation, whereas a lower NVDI reading represents unhealthy vegetation or barren ground. So if we're going to do this, the first thing we need to understand is where is actually growing crops in Zimbabwe, where is actually important if it gets affected by drought. So I took this map up here on the right this is from the UN, and then I got a rough approximation of all of the major crop growing areas in the country. Then what I did was I drew an approximate polygon, which represents generally these crop growing regions in Earth Observation Browser. And then I did an analysis of all of the NVDI readings every time a satellite passes over this area over the last 5 years. And the outcome was this. So this is a kind of confusing graph, so I'll explain it. This is over the last 5 years. The peaks represent higher NVDI levels, which correspond to better vegetation or healthier vegetation, which itself generally corresponds to the wet season. The troughs correspond to the dry season. Then what I did was I looked at the lowest points in this graph, which represented the worst part of the dry season. And generally, these were every year around 0.17 or 0.16. However, in the most recent year, they've dropped down to 0.13. Now, this difference might not seem like much, especially on the graph, it's difficult to see. However, the thing to understand is that we're looking at a very, very large area. So even a small difference and also you're looking at people that are a stable, what would normally be a stable climatic system. So if anything small changes, then it's going to cause serious repercussions to the ability to grow crops. And indeed, something has changed here, and this year, the crops are doing much worse. At the same time, I wanted to know, well, is these food shortages, the drought, and the rising price of food, is this leading to violence in the country? Because often high food prices is a very strong indicator of political violence. There's been multiple studies done proving this link. So I took a look at data from the Armed Conflict Location and Event database from Zimbabwe and looked at all of the riot and protest events in Zimbabwe. And then I graphed them over the last 10 months. And as you can see, there is sort of a trend upwards, but I would not stake any serious, I suppose, assumptions on this, because if you look further back in history, then you will see larger spikes due to other things. Yes, and in any case, if you look further back in history, then it is going to appear not actually particularly significant. Given this, I would say that if there is any link between violence and the food shortages in the country, then we are yet to see them. This being said, the situation is getting vastly worse. And right now, the UN has put the total level of food insecure people at about 60% of the country's population. So at some point, this is probably likely to see a spike in violence in the country. However, it's not occurred yet. Why hasn't it occurred? Likely due to political factors. The government has put a ban on demonstrations, which has sort of put the lid on things a bit. Also, those that have occurred have been repressed, which also has sort of created an environment of fear. So what conclusions and considerations can we take from this? Firstly, again, through the use of open data sources, we can see that the current drought is anomalous and that it could be being amplified by climate change. Political violence is increasing alongside rising food prices. However, the increase is not yet statistically significant. And then finally, with the situation clearly deteriorating, further observation is required. So I've just presented these two case studies, but what if we wanted to take a bigger look? What if we wanted to just go beyond looking at specific things that are emerging or a certain country or a certain event and wanted to see what we could do with this on a global scale? Well, in my view, open source intelligence can be used not just to look at these isolated issues, but to develop an entire picture of the enviro-political situation in a region. Such a picture could start as just a sort of visual reference tool used as a basis for narrower investigations, such as a map with a lot of different things it's displayed. Here I've got a map which I just created quite quickly of all of these sort of ongoing conflicts and violent protests in the world right now. There's probably a couple missing because I did this quite quickly. But if you could overlay this sort of thing with environmental data and then back it up with other kinds of open source data, then it could be quite a useful tool. With this in mind, I'm currently working on a project called Anthropocene Intelligence, which is effectively trying to do just that. How this will look effectively will be a visual database of all of the environmental, agricultural, and trade assets within a region. Up here on the screen, you've got a map of all these sort of primary agricultural areas in Southeast Asia, followed by all of the major dams on the Mekong River, which is a serious flashpoint in and of itself. All this data I would then like to overlay with key risk factors, which we talked about earlier, which are these things like poor governance, history of state violence, economic turmoil, and also trade embargoes, which play a significant role in whether a country is likely to face famine. And then I would also add to this by putting in updates featuring geographically tagged environmental events. So if something like a cyclone went through the region and caused significant harm, then that would be updated onto the map. One thing I forgot to mention is that when we were discussing what happened in Zimbabwe, the cyclone that hit Mozambique earlier this year also caused significant destruction to Zimbabwe's crops, which in itself was, the cyclone itself has been linked to climate change. And so when these kind of events come through, these could be easily displayed, and then we could see where they intersect with pre-existing crises and pre-existing political problems, as well as how they impact key agricultural or environmental assets. And then finally, when all of these intersections occur, then I would have the system generating alerts and using this as the basis for analysis, information, stories, etc. All right, well, thank you for listening, and we'll open up the floor to any questions that you might have about this.
So after a short break, we also go on with the workshop where there's also time to ask more questions. So I would say we can do 2 short questions now, and then after a short break, we'll dive deeper into it. So maybe if there's 1 or 2 urgent questions that we would like to do now, if there's anybody. Or maybe it was all completely clear.
So that was very
We have a
impressive.
question here. Go ahead.
Very impressive work. I'm just wondering why you are using this tool, which is to monitor climate change over time, or how landmarks are changing over time, to connect how conflicts are being, or how conflicts are occurring as a factor. Like you said, it's not a very big factor. Like a lot of other things are playing into that as well, like political and historical things. So my question is, wouldn't it be better just to have it as a tool to monitor climate change, and for answering questions why conflicts are happening in these regions, to look at historical things like colonialism, or how imperial powers are invading those regions and stole their resources?
I mean, certainly you're correct, and I mean, I don't intend to use this just for climate conflicts per se, but also humanitarian crises, economic crises, etc. And I suppose in the end, to the people living there, it doesn't really matter whether it's being caused by climate change or not. What matters is that there's a problem happening, and if we can predict that a problem is happening, then we can help, get aid there, or help get better attention to what's going on and help find solutions, etc. And potentially in the future also predict it before it happens. Does that answer your question?
All right, since we were a bit late with our time, with everything, I would say we do now a short 5-minute break, and then we all come back here to dive deeper into it with the workshop part. So thanks very much.